So I'm Kieran, Berkeley Research Group. This is Tom, head of the blockchain group at Mishcon, Reya, lawyer and rugby player. Stein, who you just heard speak, and Leo, who you also heard speak earlier today. And just a couple of initial ideas while we just wait for Taya. The regulatory space, as I kind of alluded to earlier, I think there's a very interesting quote by a Open University scholar in London who said, "Code is no more neutral than regulation, with each subject to monopoly and commercial capture." And there's also this kind of competing perspectives on we just keep regulating advanced tech the way we regulate most things, which is, we just focus on the market failure, the consumer protection and the competition issues. But there's also another competing school of thought which thinks this kind of passive wait-and-see approach to regulation of blockchain or other advanced tech is kind of not reasonable and more reflects the unwillingness of government and regulators to muster the energy or the resources to get educated and ultimately take on private interests. So we hope that's a good frame, and welcome Taya.
Thank you.
Who's CEO and co-founder of Dwala, a platform for skills verification. Mm-hmm. So let's just get straight into it. Question one, what is the real role of government to ensure a positive future for blockchain tech? Taya.
Cool. So I think the most important thing is how specifically government also collaborate with the private sector in terms of policies to make sure that we don't see regulation that hinders how the technology can be used, but that they're also that ethical voice in terms of taking care of the public and making sure that there's just not extreme expansion that's not basically taking care of the individual. One thing I also think is essential in terms of government, which is a bit interesting because we work in emerging markets where also trust to governments is also a challenge. And we've seen also that for instance, as Norway, and why we also are a Norwegian-based company, is how also we can enhance and give Norway a sense of digital signature that also can give trust back to governments also in these countries. So I think that's the way I would start.
Excellent.
I think for me it's the fact that they are in the conversation at all, and they very much have got a seat at the table. I think, I know, Kieran, in the talk earlier, you sort of characterised the as-is position of these things. Historically, governments haven't really engaged as a player within the market. They've acted as a regulator, perhaps. They might have had quite an adversarial role, but I think to move their role and their function to actually a market participant, and that doesn't have to be, that doesn't in any way have to overreach the purpose of a government. It is just a way to ensure that they are competent and in touch with market movements. I think the time for government watching what's happening and trying to react, things are moving too quickly for that. I think they very much have to have their finger on the pulse of what is going on a weekly basis, a daily basis, an hourly basis, 10-minute settlement time on Bitcoin, so maybe 10-minute basis. I just think I think they have to change their role and just make sure that they are a player, not an observer.
Totally agree. I think, as you said, I can't really see any problem with me as a government employee interacting with you guys here and now. Because it gives us the understanding about how the market actually is developing. And it gives us a lot of understanding into how can we actually support the market. But then it comes back to what should government in the future be? And I'm quite convinced that government might have to take a small step back, and we have to ensure the fundamental principles that society is built upon. and we have to do that maybe in new ways. We might actually use blockchain technology to do it. And I find that really interesting because it's kind of, also Magnus had some great points earlier that you can't like come 1 year after and say, we're going to regulate ICOs because there's hardly any ICOs left. But what we can regulate and what we have regulations for, fraud isn't allowed, simply. So I think basically regulation has to be made more generic. And I also loved your point that it can't be like technology specific. It's because technology is moving too fast. So I think maybe government has to get a bit more back to what government did 200 years ago.
Interesting position. Stein.
I'm an historian by training, actually, and looking back from my brief memory, there are basically two kind of errors which happen all the time. One is the red flag law, you know, when automobiles first arrived in the UK, a man with a red flag had to walk in front of it in order for not to scare the animals and stuff. And the other one is the risk of too lax regulation. So we had X-ray radiation weren't really regulated until the 70s. I think some of the mistakes we've done to personal data is due to lax regulation. So there are two kinds of errors there, and it's hard for the governments to find a balance. And so they need to keep their heads cool, I guess. The most pressing issues would be taxation and GDPR.
Some different views then. I think we might pick up on your point on the role of government taking a step back and what might happen if that happens. Let's pick up on that later. The second question we wanted to think about was, will more or less regulation, and then I think what kind, will drive better outcomes and more innovation, not less? Thea. Unfortunately, you're sitting closest to me. This is a shame. I'm sorry.
No. I think it's just I really like to think on the question. And I think it's essential for any kind of innovation that, like, I think we have different actors in the field that's going to push and hold back, right? We're used to government being the one holding us a bit more back. That's maybe because also for good reason sometimes, you know. I think we've seen when you want to go really fast and forward, you're sometimes not really thinking with what is history and what is also represented in history, and there's also a reason why the policies that's been made is there. Essentially, I think if we're able to, the way we're able to build the best and more the best kind of change, also with the ethical integrity that it should have, is just sitting in really, really close collaboration, making sure that in government there are technology experts, that there's also that you don't really have this strict form, but that you build sandboxes and you build these different mechanisms to make sure you have testing grounds that doesn't really affect people at grand scale, that may make sure you can learn about the different problems or challenges adapting to new technology, like one step at a time, and making sure you learn as a part of that.
I think it's just really important that we get away from this sort of paradigm in our heads that more regulation equals less innovation. This is sort of, you hear it all the time, and it's just wrong. You look at e-commerce, sort of early noughties, it was pretty flat. Sort of dot-com boom happened, it was pretty flat. Then EU introduced regulations, I think it was 2002, 2003, and investment absolutely exploded into the space. And I think good regulation and good government intervention in whatever form that is, be it soft, you know, participating in panels and having conversations, or hard, you know, legislating in a really punchy way, doing it right, it can only be a good thing. I think in terms of the second half of the question, you know, if we're saying yes, they should regulate, how should they do it, and what does that look like? It's just, as we were saying a moment ago, it's just got to be flexible enough and permissive enough that you're not regulating ICOs a year after the ship's already sailed and no one's interested anymore.
Yeah.
You're regulating and legislating a problem. Fraud already exists, and most of these tools already exist in sort of a regulator, legislator's weaponry and arsenal.
Yeah.
We just need to make sure that we're issuing clear guidance, but that guidance isn't so prescriptive and narrow to what the moment it's happened is already a historic problem. It's got to be forward-facing.
I think I just want to pick up on a point, because as we're working in Uganda, already last year, they had a blockchain conference in Uganda inviting governments and also from all over the African continent into the conference, sitting into the panels and learning and basically making sure that this is not going to be one more time where they sit on the chair and just don't understand what people are talking about. I think also that's our responsibility to invite people in and don't create distance. In Douala, we've been specifically focused on that. Making sure that we're there, we invite them into conversations, we show them what we're doing. It's not in isolation, and that they learn as a part of it. So when also they're ready to move on forward, they're able to make informative decisions, and it's not like a tag and roll, but that it's just like moving alongside each other. And when also they are ready, they can come on board and also adapt to the platforms and systems that we're building.
I'm aware that there's a Western Europe study. I think it's a French and UK collaboration, government collaboration, and they're spending a load of money doing a study into how it's basically liability apportionment on the Ether blockchain. And they've spent a load of money, and they've done the whole thing based on the current Ether. It's all about their consensus protocol, which is still all proof of work, and they're spending a load of money doing it. The intention is that migrates from proof of work to proof of stake in the next 12 months. So all of a sudden, all of that work they've done is so prescriptive and so narrow in its thoughts that it just beggars belief. I don't know why they would be spending so much money on such a narrow thing.
Yeah, and that's when I say take one step back, I don't mean that we should regulate less. Misunderstand me right. I don't think we need more regulation either. I think we need better regulation. And when it comes to innovation, it's somehow all about breaking down silos that exist. And we've been working with this IF ladder for a lot of years, the interoperability framework. So we solved technical interoperability quite a few years ago. We have APIs and stuff. We can connect stuff. That's okay. We're working a lot on semantic interoperability. That's really important for regulation. I got really happy when I saw your presentation earlier that you've been working with the vocabulary, because that's a big problem. Like when two government departments want to exchange data, like the term, which term can I use as an example? The domestic partnerships. In the Norwegian law, I think we have about 50 different definitions of what domestic partnership means in different laws. So we go from technical to semantic interoperability, and I spoke a bit in my talk about organizational interoperability, and then we come to the legal interoperability on the top. So, and that is basically the process of breaking down the legal silos. We've done that for the tech. We are doing it for creating a common language. We're doing it organizational. But the lawmakers also have to understand that the legal framework has to be more kind of horizontal. And that's what I mean with basically taking a step back, looking at what is the fundamental principles that we want our future society to be built upon.
If I could just build on that, I think one thing is very important also in terms of organizational is that we make sure that they also see and can use the value that decentralized mechanisms gives, right? So for us, we can enable them to have a digital signature. We can give them transparency on a database in terms of data that they wouldn't even have access to because it's all in silos. Giving them and making sure that they can experience it and understand that, like, oh, this is actually what it means. These are all also semantics and really in-depth things you don't really know in-depth about, but this is the value that it provides, and also that's also, I think we can build trust in terms of the technology and making sure they don't are not challenged by the hype or the challenges in terms of people see, oh, what is this? Is it Bitcoin, etc.? I think everybody's been in that conversation, and just really bring on that thought forward so we learn collectively.
Svein.
Allow me to answer the question from a slightly or totally selfish point of view. What kind of regulation would I like being vested in blockchain, and I really want this technology to grow? So what kind of regulation would I like to see? And I think it boils down to two. The one is I like either regulation or enforcing the concept of regulation that protects data ownership. The moment I can claim ownership to my health records, my property documents and whatever, you'd see there are very, very few intelligent ways of making society work with me owning the data and others using it without the use of blockchain. So enforcing personal data rights is a good thing for blockchain. And the second principle I'd like to see enforced in law or regulation is the once only principle, or once only is really one time too much. Yeah. If I put my data on a blockchain-based application, I'd like the government to go get it there rather than me having to submit it all over again. So being really strict on our reporting, on the demands for us to report, and being really permissive on our rights to claim ownership, that would greatly help blockchain, I think.
Great point. Something both of you mentioned just before was new principles or different principles that create the sort of society we want. So the comment, Leo and Thea, you made, that would suggest to me that some of the principles you're talking about are absent or not part of the regulatory process at the moment. So when you say these principles need to be sort of baked into the regulation about how we want our society to be, what ones are you talking about and why?
I think the point to specifically ownership of data is a core part that needs to be baked into it. I think, data is the goal of the future, is everything that we have moving forward, and I think it's very important that government knows the effect that has, and I think we're as we have the conversations always of what's going to happening, but it's already happening. So I think one thing, and specifically in terms of digital ownership of data, and then understanding also what does that mean on the ground for government, and specifically in terms of storage, where we have, if we're looking at an inclusion perspective, we still need storage of all that data to something. And then we're talking about private-public keys again. So it's conversations that we also need to prove, I think, as an ecosystem. And we need to build and prove that also by driving the value on the ground and building the use cases, talking less and driving more action behind it. And just so we make sure that it's also trust about that basically you don't, or how do you even work around the system if you have no backup, right? If you give all ownership to a person and you're saying this is your responsibility, and the person goes back, well, I can't have all that responsibility. So I think that's a really interesting conversation to have, but I think it's the most important one. I completely agree. I'm really curious, and both also positive in terms of that we can solve it. I just think that we need to talk less and drive more action behind it also as a community.
I completely support the point of the intellectual property of our own data, not only for private individuals but also for companies. is a really important principle we have to put down. It's not really a new principle. It's just that in the virtual world, kind of ownership has been hazed a bit down. But when it comes to our physical items, we still manage to keep them close and with us. So I think that's an important thing. But no, when I talk about principles, except for that, I agree it's the most important one. But there are like these really old principles that democracies are built on that we tend to forget. And that is the basic democratic principles, the human rights, and so on. And I think if we don't manage to kind of bake these things into the new digital infrastructure that we are making, we might actually lose something on the way. My observation is that it seems to me like we lost something on the way already.
And the fact that we are, maybe this is my naivety, and maybe I'm trying to punch too far with this suggestion, but the fact that we're building a new infrastructure is a chance for us to re-question a lot of the stuff that are, we take the answer for granted and don't re-ask ourselves, like, is democracy the best way of doing these things? And what is democracy? And how do we want our democracy to function, and to what extent? What are the limits we're happy with? What are the limits we're not happy with? We say, in a democratic society, these are our principles, and that has an automatic assumption at the very, very start that our current 2019 version of democracy is the right starting point. And as I said, maybe I'm being naive. Maybe this is going way off-piste and going far bigger in the discussion than we might otherwise do. But I do think there's a chance to have a real thought about what do we want to be as a society in 50 years' time, or what do we want to try to be as a society in 50 years' time? And in so doing, ask ourselves these probably quite difficult, very, very politically charged questions.
Stein.
I wish I could just continue where you stopped, but I had such a down-to-ground idea. And that's just to remind ourselves there are actually tons of regulation out there which was written in the 60s and 70s, trying to protect data and trying to make the best of it, and saying, in our National Citizens Registry, for example, it says there can only be one, and there must be only one person maintaining this registry. In land registries, we have concepts like the land book, the stamp tax. So there are tons of regulation which sort of didn't foresee IT and definitely didn't foresee blockchain. But it's always understood that this regulation can be changed if someone comes up with a better way of doing stuff. So I'm not worried about that regulation.
Speaking from an English law perspective, we've obviously got best part of 1,000 years of sort of case law to go on, but the most basic fundamental principle of English law is I can do anything unless there is a law against it, and the government can't do anything unless there is a law that permits it to do so. That is the very foundational basis of sort of Romanic law, of which English law is a derivative. Is that right? You know, are we happy with that? Do we say that unless there's a law prohibiting me from doing something, I can do what I want? Do we say government can't do anything unless you've got an express power? Again, very political point. But.
No, I think that's a very interesting point. It drives us to the conversation of the laws of ethics, doesn't it? It does, like, what are the things when we walk among us as people, what are the things we just trust each other to do and say and think that this is by law, like how we should be as people. We see that's being disrupted again and again and again. And I think a very interesting perspective that I like and hold also the Walla ground to is the ethical integrity in terms of how we build our product. Like ethics should also be built in your product. What kind of behavior patterns you also drive, what you incentivize, what are the economic value, how is economic value also in your company also balanced in the way like what you're driving forces, and specifically in terms of data. I think that's also why we're with multi-billion companies right now as well, because that's not also talked about.
Kieran, I know you're trying to wrap up, but just one observation of this conversation. How great is it that we're not talking about really, really technical points? Because as you said in your talk earlier, the tech is not what gets in the way of these things. It's the big questions, the human interactions and the humans that utilise these tech that is where the actual interesting discussion is, I think.
And on the final question, and we could have about 6 panels on ethics and the future of democracy, is what are the political issues and the consumer or citizen mindset challenges facing the regulation of advanced tech and the regulation of blockchain? So sort of what's the political and the citizen challenges here?
People.
Yes, people are a challenge, quite right.
People, we don't want
Huge
more,
challenge.
like, there's very few people you would ask that wants more responsibility, right? When you're looking at specifically decentralized identity in space, you're saying, but, like, why do I need all of this? I don't really want that. I want the easiest way. That's usually how we are as people. And I think this is where we're adapting, but so I need to like download one more app to have this and the backup of this. I don't really want that. I want the easiest way. So I think that's the challenge that we see in terms of adaptation and making sure like, but why do I need this? But I think that's also how, like again, how we build it and design it, making sure it's as easy as possible. That drives you back to language, ethics, all these things that make sure that you don't really need to understand blockchain or decentralized and all these different words. You need to understand what value it gives you.
Stein, final word, make it count.
If you say people, I say process. We make laws the same way, pretty much the same way as we did in the 1820s. And it's not at all fitted to the scale and speed of change we're seeing around us. So let's try and make laws temporarily and see if they work and then change them. Let's use technology rather than command and control. Let's use involvement. Let's use all the tricks in lean software development and apply them to lawmaking. And maybe it eventually will catch up.
Reya, last word, make it count.
Agile lawmaking.
Agile lawmaking. Well, it's more than one word, but very good. Tom.
Focus on why we should care, I think, for all of these things. Focus on the bigger picture. No one cares about being technologically advanced. No one cares. They want their internet to go quicker. They want their data to be secure. They want to be able to get healthcare. They want their great aunt Betty to live in a nice care home. People have problems. They don't care about being tech advanced for the sake of being tech advanced. They just want those problems to be solved.
I think if I can finish with that, we just need to understand that we speak to people, right? And that's what speaking to your point.
Yeah. Thank you very much to the panel. Excellent points. Big round of applause for them. Thank you so much.